to and trauma help us think about theology and the Bible in a better way? Or can theology help us think about trauma? Is there a relationship between the two and moving forward? That's what we're talking about today. I'm asking why a trauma therapist would want to study the Bible. As always, I am Jeff Holsclaw, and this is the Embodied Faith podcast, where we're seeking to integrate neuroscience, spiritual formation, and faith. And we're brought to you by Grassroots. Oh. Are you there? I thought I lost you. I think I did lose her. Oh no. We're experiencing technical difficulties, and I'm going to see if Adrienne jumps back. Aha, are you there?
I'm back.
Okay, I don't know if that was me or you. All you did was you missed the intro video there, but we will just jump in. So this is Adrienne Gibson, who is a licensed professional counselor and a clinical supervisor with over 16 years of experience in the field of mental health. She specializes in the treatment of complex trauma, especially childhood abuse, neglect, and chronic unhealthy relationships in foster and adoption issues. And she's soon to graduate with a master's in theology, or a master's in New Testament at Northern Seminary. Hooray. Adrienne, welcome so much to the podcast.
Thank you.
Yes, and hopefully we won't have any other technical issues.
I hope so.
You know, since I'm part of the charismatic tradition, we'll just say that spiritual warfare, trying to interrupt such an important topic. So I don't remember if it was on Twitter or if it was somewhere else. You were kind of mentioning your work and how you had gone to seminary. And actually, I had you as a student, but I didn't know that you'd come from a professional field, clinical field, to then enter into seminary after over a decade or so. So could you kind of just tell us a little bit what you've been doing in your profession, and then what led you to this New Testament program? Why did you want to study the Bible in order to help you, I assume, be a better or more fully formed therapist? Is that right?
Of course, that's right. Yeah, so I graduated in 2005 from Denver Seminary with a master's in counseling and jumped right into the field, worked on getting licensure. And so my counseling background has kind of gone from agency work, which is working with community mental health, low income government assistance. And then I kind of pull back and go into private practice, which just works with a totally different population. And then I miss community mental health and kind of go back into it. But that, I think, because my background started with community mental health, that gave me a very broad and wide experience of working with children and families in trauma. You're working with a low socioeconomic status group that often the parents were raised in trauma, and they are trying to do a better job, but they're often raising their children in trauma. And so what that means for a clinician working in that environment is we have to learn and manage what secondary trauma is, or vicarious trauma, very quickly. You pick up a lot of really hard stories, and I find it's like 10 times the amount when you're working with kids, because you're hearing their trauma stories and they don't know why this is happening or what is going on. And when you're working with an adult with trauma, they have more control over their life. They have more control over their situations, and we can work on either getting them out of the traumatic situation or finding themselves in less trauma. With a child, you can't always get them out of the traumatic situation. So yeah, so for 16 years, I feel like I've been learning to manage how to work with complex developmental trauma. And then I have to, for me, I know many people who have done it for 20, 30 years and stay in agency work, and I wonder how they do it. I've had to take steps out and take breaks for my own mental health and for my own self-care when it got to be too much. And then I will go into private practice. That's not to say private practice, you're not working with trauma. You're working with a different level and type of people. And it works differently. And then I've stepped back into it. So I actually just recently left community mental health, December 11th. I resigned as the clinical director at A New Leaf and have stepped back into private practice. But what led me to going to Northern Seminary? So
well, hold on. Before we get to the Northern Seminary, could you slow down and just tell us what is complex developmental trauma, at least as far as you understand it?
Yeah.
And then sometimes people who are in adoption and foster care, they know this other term, ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences. So could you just kind of explain that just real briefly for those who may not understand?
Can I do one and not the other? I'm going to get
either
to the
way.
other. Yep.
Okay,
so
great.
You ask really great questions because it's a great question because complex developmental trauma is not a diagnosis that we can diagnose someone with. And so in the clinical world, there's many of us who are very frustrated with this problem because the diagnosis for trauma came about in 1980 after the Vietnam War. It was actually because of the veterans of Vietnam. They fought to get a diagnosis like this. So we have post-traumatic stress disorder because of Vietnam vets, 1980. That's when it appeared in the DSM. That's the only trauma diagnosis we have. And the DSM-5 that just came out within the last 10 years updated it to be acute or chronic. So you can have PTSD for an extended period of time or just a short period of time. So complex developmental trauma is a diagnosis that Bessel van der Kolk started fighting for a little over 10 years ago with the research that he has done with children in trauma. The difference is the fact that complex developmental trauma is trauma that takes place in a child's life when they're young, and it's often by their caregiver, the person who's actually supposed to be protecting them and taking care of them. And so what we know about how trauma disrupts brain development, and like his book says, the body keeps the score. We hold it in our body for a significant period of time. So we've got these children who are growing up in these really traumatic, volatile situations where their parents are the ones who are causing the trauma. Complex developmental trauma is its own beast. It needs its own diagnosis. These children often struggle with attachment and relationships for the rest of their life. They don't feel safe for the rest of their life. They don't know how to feel safe. They've had biochemicals released in their body for most of their developmental period because our brain doesn't stop developing until it's 25. So trauma disrupts how our brain works because it pulls us out of our prefrontal cortex as it develops and pulls it into the amygdala. And so these people, and when we go into our amygdala, we're thinking of short-term, no consequences. We're very irrational. We lose our ability to communicate. So these children so complex developmental trauma, it is its own thing in that they struggle with things for the rest of their life because of how their brain developed in this. So that is complex developmental trauma. Many people will use the term, but there is no formal diagnosis for it.
Okay, well, that's super helpful. And the thing that I just want to kind of emphasize is what you said is that it's happening during brain development stages through the childhood kind of life. And so it's different than adult trauma who, in best case scenarios, adults have a functioning, brain that developed properly. But then because of an adult trauma like PTSD, Vietnam War, those different parts just stop working or they're not integrated in these types of things. But in theory, they're there. But with childhood developmental trauma is, like you said, their brains actually are being wired in certain ways so that they're not integrated. They don't have the possibility of being integrated. And so it just really puts them back. And then the other thing too is a lot of times we think of like abuse and then maybe neglect as triggers for trauma, but it is actually broader than that. There could just be like a parent could be sick or could die. And so there is it's not like an overt malicious neglect. It's just, it is, or growing up in poverty, there's just chronic stress, walking to school, different kind of threat environment. So it's not always the parents are bad parents, right? So
correct. Right. Parents could be doing the best job. Yes. But if they can't put food on the table every night and this child grows up not knowing when they're going to eat next, that is complex trauma.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. All right. Well, did I say anything wrong there? Do you need me to correct any?
No.
Feel free. Okay. So now I cut you off. So then you've been practicing, you've been going back and forth for your own mental health between community service and private sector. But then you were just about to launch into this why Northern Seminary.
Yeah. So 5 years ago now, Phoenix Seminary reached out to me and asked me to teach a course on trauma. They do a master's in counseling. So I knew it was teaching a graduate course to future counselors. And so I said, yeah, sign me up. It was a summer course. I had to figure out what I was going to do for 10 weeks, 3 hours once a week. And so I was surprised when I showed up. I had about 17 students and 4 of them were MDivs. And I thought, I didn't prepare a class for people not going into clinical work. So I had to do some quick readjusting. But in the course of teaching this 10 weeks, I think that's when God got a hold of like, Adrienne, what are you doing? Like, do you want to just be a counselor for the rest of your life? Because I love teaching and I love passing on this information. Because whenever I get anyone who's like, tell me about trauma, tell me about the ACEs, I'm like, sign me up. You want to talk about boundaries? I'll teach you about boundaries. So here I was teaching these students who were going to be future counselors, but I had these 4 MDivs that I could not ignore that were in my class that had signed up to learn about trauma. And it was teaching this course and teaching them that I realized the church field, pastors, people wanting to do pastoral work, they need to have a ground level 30,000 foot view of trauma. So I taught it in such a way of like, what would I want everybody to know about trauma? So it was an introductory course. So of course, these clinicians could have gotten more into it if they needed to. And it got pretty high tech. Like I taught a whole week on the neuroscience of like what's going on in our brain when it starts to shut down with trauma. But I kept reminding these MDiv students who weren't going to be using trauma clinically that I liked that they knew this because they were going to continue to have traumatized individuals stepping into their office as part of their congregation. And that's what I kept realizing that. So growing up in the church in the 80s and 90s, there was no referring out for counseling. It was, you're going to work with a pastor. We're going to make sure that you don't get on psychiatric medication because it's not good for you. All of your answers are here that the pastor can discover with you, and they're going to pray about it. And so that's what led a lot of people to, think I can't get over my depression, so my faith isn't strong enough.
Right.
But what's interesting is I'm married to a pastor for 22 years. So I've got this inside scoop now into ministry work where I've now seen the pendulum swing a little bit, but too far. In that now I think when we hear words like anxiety, depression, trauma, abuse, pastors refer out, which is good. But what I'm saying, I think I've seen the pendulum swing too far, is they often then don't know how to integrate or work with that person in their congregation. Like what kind of relationship is that person forming in the church? How is the pastor staying in touch with someone who is working through significant childhood trauma? Because now the pastor needs to know this person struggles with having safe relationships, struggles with making friends, struggles with going to a small group, struggles with being told what to do over and over again. And so that's why I'm saying I like how I've seen the pendulum swing, but now I think I'm trying to figure out how to bring it back for pastors to feel better equipped to understand what is going on in someone's brain, in their body when they're working through these mental health issues. And I'm seeing them just kind of shoved out of church community and they don't know how to come back.
Okay.
And so that's what got me interested. So my husband started talking to me about applying to Northern Seminary. What's funny is I was teaching the course and I'm like, I don't have any time to like even fill out the application. I don't know why you're asking me to do this. He sees great things in me. He's my biggest cheerleader. Yeah. And so he said, why don't you just fill it out because you're going to miss the deadline. And then if you don't want to do it, you defer or you tell them you've changed your mind. He's like, but why don't we just do it? So when you're done with the course, you could jump into school. So I do think it was the course that was priming me to go, I want to help the church more with what I know, and I don't know how to do that. Because the church hasn't wanted to use me before. So now I'm like, so why don't I just put my foot in the church and start studying what I need to know to help pastors and to help lay individuals who are volunteers? Like, what can I do to bridge these two the best I can to know there are so many traumatized individuals in the church. how are we helping them other than pushing them out and saying, get a counselor?
Right. So that's really great. I love that. And so, hopefully, your time in seminary, you're able to kind of learn the language, churchy language, right? I know you're married to a pastor and whatnot, but like all the churchy theology language. But then I assume you're building bridges between that one kind of way of talking as well as the therapeutic kind of way, and being like, oh, there's probably overlaps, or, and you could let us know, like, oh, this is why people have all these hangups because of the way we talk about the Bible, and things like that, which is fine too. So what have you been finding as you've now entered into this churchy world of New Testament studies? How has that helped or changed or
Well, it's
transformed some of your
changed.
questions?
Yeah, it's changed who I am as a speaker. So I do get invited to speak at things about like how I threw out boundaries. I get invited all the time to talk about boundaries. I get invited to talk to students about things. So when I would first go to these talks, I felt very comfortable public speaking if it was in the psychology realm. I was like, if it can stay all psychology, I'm totally fine. And then about a year or two into seminary, some of these people who were inviting me to speak realized, you're going to Northern. Can you do something more faith-based and not so psychological? And I'm like, oh. So what I've seen it change my talks. So I've now done some speaking on being made in the image of God and what that means for us. I did one for a youth group and a parenting group just a few months ago on why emotions matter. And so I think that's been my favorite one so far, again, because the church has really tried to split them. We've got good emotions, we've got bad emotions. I need you to stay away from your bad emotions, which are like anger and revenge and depression. And so I just talk to these people about like all of our emotions are valid and they're okay. And we're not going to label them good or bad and why they matter, because God made us to have all those emotions. And you know what? Right now, it's really hit or miss. People like it or people hate it. And I get the feedback from people who like it, and I get the feedback from people who hate it.
You still with me there?
Yes, sorry. I saw that glitchy. You froze. I know.
Well, good. Well, yeah, actually, I know, I'm pretty sure you probably know Becky Castle Miller. I had her on to talk about emotions also.
Right.
So it'd be great to keep talking about emotions. But so I'm trying to ask a question. With your like clinical experience, and you were reading, a bunch about Paul and Romans and studying with Scott McKnight and, hopefully Jesus and these types of things. How is it that like that training kind of elucidated or kind of like brought different things to your biblical study that maybe other students of yours in your program maybe weren't, seeing or noticing? Did that happen at all?
It happened recently in a class we had a few semesters ago. We read Cruciformity, maybe in your class. Is that a book that you have theology students read?
I love that book, but I didn't assign it. So it's probably Scott or something like that. Right. Michael Gorman.
Yeah. And then we read it just a few semesters ago with Nijay Gupta.
Okay.
And so different things came up for different students, but it was eye-opening for me because it was about emptying yourself and being able to really sacrifice who you are. And it challenged a bunch of people because of the power differential when you have someone who's being abused or who is in a very unhealthy or unsafe relationship. Like, so how could you talk to a woman in a domestic violence situation about cruciformity? And so I do think some of the experience of the work that I do with very hurt and broken people challenges some of the stuff now I read. Now, for me, it was easier to understand because I think I look at things of how we talk to people about being in safe relationships and what we can ask of them and what we can't, because that's us being trauma informed of like not asking someone with no power in a relationship to empty themselves of the power they don't have.
Right.
But I think that I didn't struggle so much with understanding that in that context as much as a few other people did, because I thought I always go the trauma informed route, but that is going to be where I look at things.
And I think that's really important is, it's like spiritual formation topics of learning to carry your own cross and being humble and humility and these types of things. They're part of scripture, and And in a sense, like Jesus lived in a trauma-filled world, in first century Palestine. So it's not like he's unaware of those things, right? But I think the way they get appropriated in our Western kind of culture, and especially if you have men speaking about carrying your cross and humble, blah, blah, that can heap extra burdens, burning coals on those who've been traumatized. And then rather than lifting them up and encouraging them, it just becomes, more weight.
Yeah.
And so I'm so glad for people like you and others, to kind of bring not that, because I see, and maybe you run into this too, I see others being like, that kind of talk of carrying your cross has no place for, in a trauma-informed church. Like, we got to stop talking about that, which I think goes too far the other way, right? So there needs to be like, how do all these things fit together? And so I'm glad you're bringing that,
Right.
forward. So what is now that you're close to the end of your time at Northern, it requires like a big project. So like, what is this big project that you've been thinking and wondering about?
Yeah, so I'm writing about trauma and the church. And what's funny is whenever I say that, people are like, yes, the church is causing so much trauma, right? And I'm like, no. Like, that would be a great time. Yeah, I get it. But no, it's about giving pastors that 30,000 foot view of trauma. So the first chapter has nothing really to do with the New Testament. Sorry, Scott McKnight. I hope that's okay. You haven't read my first chapter yet, but it is to give this. If I could get everyone to listen about trauma and how it affects us and what it's doing in our body, this is what I just need people to know. These are the people who are walking into your door, walking into the church, walking into Bible studies. And then the rest of the chapters are about how traumatized people should be healing in the church with the messages, if we present them theologically in a way that is helpful for them. So the other chapters are about understanding wisdom. We need to actually know God and that he has absolute wisdom, but it doesn't work the way our wisdom works. Good things don't always happen to good people, and bad things just don't happen to bad people. And then it goes on to understanding trust. So we have to get that basis of trust. Jesus models that trust because he fully understands his plan and purpose. Like, he's the epitome of being able to trust someone, like full trust in the Father. It makes me think of that verse in Matthew 5, like the flowers of the field and the birds of the air. Like, he literally was the example of living his life like this.
Amen. And
then the fourth chapter is understanding power, that we have the power through the Holy Spirit to be able to trust people, but we have the power through the Holy Spirit to heal in this environment. Hopefully there are people around you who want you to heal, and understanding that power that we have through the Holy Spirit can totally and completely heal us, can heal all the things that happened in our memory, can heal all the things that have happened in our brain, can heal all of that stuff that went on with all those chemicals that released. And then the last chapter, where I've spent the majority of my time now, is understanding community. Because the church needs to be a community for these people. And I think the churches that I have been a part of for the majority of my life are not a true community. They're not my family. They're not my second, this family. But the way that family is talked about in the New Testament, the family terminology that Jesus used, the family terminology then that Paul takes and just goes crazy with, is brothers and sisters. And that is then the trusting, safe, healthy environment that traumatized people should be able to heal in when those things work right. So it's an understanding of trauma, and then it's an understanding of the theology of how the church is the perfect place for people with trauma to heal.
Right.
And then that leads us into ACEs. So my trauma chapter ends with, why should pastors care about this? Do we really have people walking around with all of this PTSD, with all of these traumatic events that are happening? And they're like, come on. Yeah, I'm going to run into some PTSD people, I'm sure. So that ACEs, I'll just jump in. So it was a study that was done in 1994 and 1995 by a doctor named Vincent Felitti with Kaiser Permanente. He was a bariatric surgeon. And he was trying to understand his patients a little better, and doing background and history with them, he realized a lot of people with morbid obesity had significant childhood trauma. And he's like, is there a correlation? So he sent out a survey. So this is what became ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. It's 10 questions. It still exists. It's online. I'm not advising anybody to just jump online and look at these 10 questions. It's very triggering. So it needs to be done in a safe environment. You might need to check in with people if you jump online and want to look at it, because it's 10 questions and it's a binary survey. It's yes or no. If it's a yes, you get 1. If it's a no, you get 0. So your ACE score is anywhere from 0 to 10. The higher it is, the more traumatic or adverse events you've had in your life. So the study became so significant because he sent it out and he got over 17,000 responses.
Wow.
So it just became this massive study because so many people responded with it. Now, what's interesting is he is medical. So what he found was, so here's some of the statistics I'll give you. Of the more than 17,000 respondents, more than 25% grew up in households with alcoholic parents or drug-using parents. 25% had been beaten as children, and 2/3 had at least one childhood event. So at 75% of this population had at least one. Now, that doesn't surprise me. If you look at the ACEs, one of the questions on there is, did your parents get divorced? Mm-hmm. And I love that that question has stayed on the ACEs, even though it's become quite common, because the children I work with, this is a really big deal. And children really struggle with this because it's not the divorce event that causes trauma. It's the instability of the home leading up to the event of divorce. It's usually a very unstable house. So 1 in 6 of these 17,000 plus respondents had 4 or more adverse events.
Wow.
So ACEs was termed the silent epidemic that no one is paying attention to. Mm-hmm. And since it was done for the medical community, what they found was the higher your ACE score, the more likelihood you are to struggle with physical illnesses later on in life. So people with an ACE score of 4 or more, there is a 250% increase in heart disease later on in life. There is a 250% increase in risk for strokes and a 400% increase in loss of vision. This is just if you have a 4 or more.
Wow.
You are 6 times more likely to have sex before the age of 15 and 12 times more likely to have attempted suicide. So again, medical community, awesome study because they're trying to be proactive instead of reactive. They're saying if I'm working with so many people who have heart disease or diabetes, now I'm seeing that all of these adverse childhood experiences lead to a higher risk of having these medical complications later in life. Great medical health study. But it became massive for mental health because now we're seeing the higher your ACE score, the lower capacity of healthy mental health later on in life. A 12 times increase in suicide attempts. So again, ACEs is the silent epidemic nobody is talking about. 75% of these people had 1 ACE score and 1 in 6 had an ACE score of 4 or more. And these are hard questions. These are like, did you know if you were going to get fed at night? Did one of your caregivers hit one of your other caregivers? Did one of them go to prison? And so we are dealing with a population that has increased childhood trauma. And that's why I think pastors, people, community people, anyone in the helping profession of any type needs to be aware of ACEs, of childhood trauma, and of complex developmental trauma.
Yeah. Well, thank you can you send me a link or something to that study or those statistics? That'd be great. I'd love to get that as part of the show notes. And I think, so just as a reminder, don't Google ACEs and take the test. This is not like a Enneagram or Myers-Briggs test where you can, just take it for fun and kind of read a thing about. So, if you feel like maybe this is true of you, like contact a therapist or talk to someone first and then, slowly ease into it. I think, and we've talked about this in other episodes, that whether it's trauma or ACEs and these types of things, for pastors, even for parents, or for the individual selves, like this information is supposed to create like compassion, because people act out, kind of, they act out of a certain kind of framework because they have and they don't have a choice about it. I know, like, I struggle with this as a parent, like, oh, my kids, they should try harder and choose differently, and they just need to be rational, right? And that's for normal functioning kids. But as pastors, I know as a pastor, you get frustrated with so-and-so, like, why do they keep doing that? Or don't they, like, why can't they believe the best in me? Or why are they always being so negative about stuff, blah, blah, blah. but it's not like people are choosing this. It's not like they wake up and they're going to be like, I am going to be a grumpy, negative, person all day, or I will, at the slightest hint of conflict, I'm going to wilt and leave and not participate anymore because, that's how I want to be, right? People don't have a choice about these things. This is just, this is their survival responses based in the environment that they were raised in. And so I think that should, help pastors. So did that happen when you were teaching this class with these MDiv students? Did they kind of did you see them being like, I guess if they're really young, then maybe they didn't have a lot of pastoral experience, but have you seen that happen with pastors where you explain these things? They're like, oh, that's why so-and-so acts that way. And I need to have more compassion and kindness about that response rather than just wagging my finger and wishing they'd just leave or something like that.
That's exactly what happens. Yeah. And that's the basis of trauma-informed care. We make it really complex sometimes. Trauma-informed care is somewhat hard to understand. It just means I don't want to create more issues than the issues that the person walked in with based on the questions I asked. But trauma-informed care in a nutshell has been broken down to, instead of asking what's wrong with you, we should ask what happened to you.
That's so great.
And so, yeah, when you're talking about all those relationships that you think through and go, maybe that's why they're grumpy. Maybe that's why they seem to wake up this way. Maybe that's why they're always thinking the worst about every situation. Maybe that's why they think I'm attacking them every time I open my mouth. Change the question of what's wrong with you to potentially what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what happened to make this situation one where you always think I'm attacking you? And you'll get more information instead of what's wrong with you. They don't know what's wrong with them, but they do know what happened to them.
Right. Well, I think the hope is if you could switch. So the fear that I hear from certain people more on the conservative end is, well, being trauma informed is this new way of just letting people be the way they are and not demanding the challenge and change and transformation of following Christ and carrying his cross. And we're just letting people run all over the church and not dealing with the issues, the sin that's in their life. And that's kind of the fear that I sometimes hear from people. And like you said, I think that pendulum can swing too far where we're just outsourcing therapy and we don't have any way of understanding, these things. So, but you're not saying that. And just by asking someone what happened to you, that doesn't mean they're absolved of all bad behavior. That doesn't mean they have zero responsibility for their life, because they do. But it just reframes kind of how it is that you can be alongside people rather than kind of like against them.
It leaves them more open than to also see the correlation. What happened to you? And then they share it. Then you go, okay, so that's why you think the worst of this situation. Otherwise, they're not going to see that correlation of, you only see the worst in people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the what is wrong with you often just reinforces their own mystification, right? I don't know why I just did what I did. But now I feel doubly bad because I felt bad that I did it. And now you're angry at me for having done it. But asking the question of what happened to you is actually part of the recovery process, is just narrating your life, sharing it with somebody. So now you're creating an intersubjective kind of moment of compassion. And then, as a pastor or just a friend, you can ask, oh, so when I did this, it made you remember or feel like or experience that. And then they're like, oh, and then it takes the conflict away. So,
and it makes you such a safe person. Mm-hmm. You've just become a safe person for them.
Yeah. They now had the feeling of they felt, feeling felt.
Yeah.
It's different than knowing that someone heard you. This is a whole nother topic. Like when people say, I see you or I hear you, I'm always just like, those are just not quite as clear as people want to be felt. They want to know that you understood their feeling in the moment.
That's powerful. I felt you.
Yeah, I felt you. Instead of I see, like online or in person, it's like, oh, I see what you're going through. It's like, no, they want to know that you feel what they're going through.
Yeah.
Anyhow, well, thank you so much for jumping in. Any last thoughts just things you've been wondering about on this trajectory from being a therapist to now, bringing these things? I'm really excited. So please keep me posted and others about this thesis, which will eventually be a book and a whole speaking series, I'm sure.
That's what's up in the air. That's what I'm going to leave you with. I still don't know when I graduate. People are like, what are you doing with this? And I'm like, I don't know.
Mhm.
I think it's my own process. I'm writing this chapter of understanding trust. I think it's just God saying, you keep trust to me.
Yeah.
Just take one step at a time. So I'm just getting to graduation in trust, going, what are you going to do with all this?
Mhm.
Other than just being highly educated.
Well, maybe whenever it is that you do finish, we could talk about, these chapters on power and community. I think that'd be super important. So maybe we'll do this again.
Maybe.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Oh, and then where can people find you? And, eventually this, magnum
Yeah, so
opus.
right now, all my information is on my website for my private practice. If anyone wanted to get in touch with me or has any questions, it is www.valor, VALOR, counselingaz.com.
And is that your own private practice or
That's
is
my
it
private
group? Okay. So
That's just me.
got it.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking a little time out of your work and your studies to talk about all this stuff.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely.